a coordinated assault that unfolded not over weeks, not over days, but in mere hours. Hours that reshaped the battlefield, hours that tested the limits of Western resolve, hours that forced every major capital from Washington to Brussels to recalculate what comes next. What Vladimir Putin did in the dark of night crossed a line that Western leaders had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. They responded with precision, speed, and a defiance that left even hardened military analysts struggling for words. This was not a routine exchange of fire. This was not another incremental push. This was something different. And tonight, we break down exactly what happened, what it means, and why the next 72 hours could determine the direction of this conflict for months to come. For weeks now, there have been signals, not from official Russian statements, not from formal diplomatic channels, just signals that the Kremlin was preparing something unusual. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a predictability. Military observers had grown accustomed to monitoring Russia's escalation patterns, the way forces would mobilize, the way propaganda would intensify, the way cyber operations would precede kinetic strikes. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the movement of strategic bomber squadrons, the repositioning of mobile missile launchers, the sudden increase in encrypted communications between command structures, the unexpected drawdown of frontline troop rotations. All of that went quiet. There were no unusual troop movements detected along the northern axis. Satellite imagery showed staging areas that had been bustling with activity suddenly dormant. Even the constant drone reconnaissance flights that Russia had been conducting over Ukrainian positions dropped by nearly 40%. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. This is a pattern that American intelligence has observed repeatedly since February 2022. The periods of relative calm are not pauses, they are preparations. And this time the preparation was for something that would test the limits of everything NATO had put in place. Early this morning, US Space Command detected what they described as unusual activity across multiple Russian military installations, including the deployment of Tu-160 strategic bombers that had not been repositioned in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Moscow only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, provocation, or preparation for a major offensive. Observers at the Pentagon didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his operational posture, and when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by small degrees, every intelligence agency in the Western alliance pays attention. Within hours, additional reports confirmed what many had feared. Multiple waves of cruise missiles launched from positions in the Black Sea, from aircraft over Belarusian airspace, and from ground installations deep inside Russian territory, were converging on Ukrainian cities. This was not a targeted strike on military infrastructure. This was a saturation attack, the kind designed to overwhelm air defenses, maximize destruction, and send a message that could not be ignored. The message was clear. Putin was no longer interested in incremental gains. He was going for a knockout blow. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Official after official, speaking in background briefings throughout the day, described Putin's move as unprecedented in scale since the opening weeks of the invasion, deliberately timed to coincide with reduced Western attention, and perhaps most importantly, designed to test whether Ukraine's allies would waver. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, Ukraine's response today was among the most coordinated and aggressive we've seen since the liberation of Kherson. Here's what we know. Within 90 minutes of the first wave of Russian missiles entering Ukrainian airspace, Kyiv activated every layer of its air defense network. These weren't the scattered intercepts we've seen in previous attacks. These were coordinated engagements, systems working in tandem, targeting incoming missiles with a precision that suggested extensive preparation. Patriot batteries, NASAMS launchers, German Iris-T systems, and even older Soviet-era S-300 units all engaged simultaneously. According to preliminary Ukrainian military reports, over 73% of incoming projectiles were intercepted before reaching their targets. But Ukraine didn't stop at defense, they struck back. Tonight, multiple sources confirm that Ukraine launched retaliatory operations on Russian military positions, including a command and control facility in occupied Luhansk that had recently been upgraded for what analysts believe was coordination of this very attack. Ukrainian forces struck before Russia could consolidate gains. They hit ammunition depots in Belgorod. They hit fuel storage facilities near the Crimean Bridge. They hit forward operating bases that were likely preparing to support a ground offensive. In other words, Ukraine targeted the logistics backbone that would have made Russia's next phase operational, the nervous system of Putin's assault. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Russia's midnight attack wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could reshape the front lines if left unchecked. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't panic, they didn't retreat. They hit the supply lines, they hit the command structures, they hit the assets that Russia cannot easily replace. And in doing so, Ukraine sent a message that echoed across every capital watching this conflict unfold. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of NATO support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and Brussels. Putin wanted to see whether Ukraine's allies would delay shipments, issue tepid statements, or quietly signal that negotiations were preferable to continued confrontation. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO didn't hesitate. The Pentagon issued a response that was so immediate, so unified, that even the Kremlin appeared caught off guard. You don't get Russia's attention easily, but today the Western alliance did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Putin's shift as a stress test, a way to probe for cracks in the coalition that has kept Ukraine armed and fighting for over 2 years. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both capable and determined. Their counterstrikes were not only swift, they were calibrated so precisely that initial damage assessments suggest significant Russian losses with minimal Ukrainian exposure. That precision matters because it shows something Putin cannot ignore. It shows that Ukraine is not merely surviving, they are adapting, they are innovating, and they are becoming more dangerous to Russian operations with every passing month. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out strikes on oil refineries inside Russia, forcing emergency shutdowns at facilities that supply fuel to frontline forces. Special operations teams targeted rail infrastructure that had been restored in the last 72 hours. Naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly disabled a Russian patrol vessel being used to coordinate missile launches. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense. This was strategic degradation, this was operational disruption, and operational disruption is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed push toward Kyiv in the early months of the war. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates the logistics, stretches the supply lines, and forces Russian commanders to fight on terms they did not choose. Tonight was no different, except tonight the stakes were higher than they have been in months. Remember, Putin thought this war would last weeks. He thought Kyiv would fall in days. He thought NATO would fracture under economic pressure. He thought Ukraine's military would collapse without Western intervention. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Kyiv is standing, NATO is coordinating, Ukraine is striking back. Every assumption that guided Russia's initial invasion has been proven wrong, and every attempt to recalibrate to find a new path to victory has been met with resistance that Russia simply did not anticipate. This is the context in which tonight's attack must be understood. Putin is not escalating from strength, he is escalating from frustration. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when the Russian president is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Hardliners in Moscow want a full mobilization and total war footing. Oligarchs want economic stability and sanctions relief. Military commanders want more resources and fewer political constraints. The Russian public wants an end to a war that has cost far more than they were promised. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a military that has suffered staggering losses in personnel and equipment. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's attack was not a sign of Russian confidence, it was a sign of Russian desperation, an attempt to force a change in momentum before the window closes entirely. The Pentagon statement, now distributed to NATO allies and partner nations, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russia to dictate the terms of this conflict. Officials said plainly that Russia's actions were inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation or diplomatic resolution. That is diplomatic language for "we see what you're doing and we're not backing down." You don't usually hear that tone from the Defense Department unless something serious is at stake, and tonight something is. The statement went on to confirm that additional military support, including air defense ammunition and intelligence sharing assets, would be expedited to Ukraine in the coming days. This was not a vague promise, this was a commitment delivered with urgency. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a defiant, measured speech tonight. He said, "They attacked us in darkness, thinking we would not see, but we see everything, and we strike back." He said, "Every missile they fire strengthens our resolve. Every life they take deepens our commitment." And he said, "Ukraine does not negotiate with terror. Ukraine answers terror with strength." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. And they are statements designed to reassure not only the Ukrainian people, but every ally watching from abroad. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the missile barrage, Belarusian forces also conducted unusual movements near the northern border. Russian cyber units launched coordinated attacks on Ukrainian financial infrastructure, state media, increased propaganda operations targeting Western audiences. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This was not a single strike. This was a coordinated campaign designed to hit Ukraine from every angle and test every weakness. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a renewed ground offensive designed to capitalize on the confusion caused by tonight's strikes. Another is that he is attempting to force Western leaders to the negotiating table by demonstrating that the cost of continued support will only increase. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish a new normal of escalation, one where attacks of this magnitude become routine rather than exceptional. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for international condemnation. They didn't wait for diplomatic pressure. They didn't wait for the next news cycle. They struck back immediately, decisively, and with devastating effect. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Putin wants to see whether Ukraine and its allies will tire before Russia does. Zelensky wants to show that Ukrainian resolve cannot be broken by missile strikes or political games. Washington wants to prevent this conflict from escalating into something that draws NATO into direct confrontation. And Moscow wants to prevent exactly the kind of unified response we saw tonight. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian positions for signs of follow-up operations. They say there is no indication that Russia is preparing an immediate ground offensive. They say the missile attack appears to have exhausted a significant portion of Russia's available cruise missile inventory. And they say Putin's decision to strike now is likely part of a broader psychological campaign intended to fracture Western support before the spring. But Ukraine is not retreating. In fact, Ukraine is advancing both on the battlefield and in the information war. Their response today, immediate, precise, and unapologetic, sent a message to Putin that Ukraine will not be intimidated. And it sent a message to NATO that their investment in Ukrainian defense is paying dividends. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this midnight attack. But what we do know is that the Pentagon's warning was timely. It allowed Ukrainian forces to prepare for the onslaught. It enabled Western allies to coordinate their response. And it demonstrated that intelligence sharing between NATO and Ukraine has reached a level of effectiveness that Russia cannot ignore. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he retreats to assess the damage, this moment will be remembered as another failed attempt to break Ukrainian will. If he escalates further, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are ready, more ready than they have ever been. They have shown they are prepared to respond with everything they have. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be silent. Moscow is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is recalculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before but refuses to accept. Ukraine will not break, the West will not fracture, and this war cannot be won with missiles alone. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine stood firm. The alliance held, and the response was fierce. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this historic conflict unfolds.